Welcome everyone to week 3, and we're looking at design issues this week. Essentially trying to turn your research design or your research idea into a project to solve problems, okay? So, quick overview. Looking at research design, some of your key considerations, things like that. Talking about fixed versus flexible designs, and primary versus secondary research. So just some key concepts, some key ideas that you need to know for research. First off though, some of the things in the news. And these are just some things that caught my eye over the past week or two. AirAsia X gives kids the boot. Essentially what's going to be happening with this AirAsia is that the first 7 rows of economy, there will be no kids allowed, no kids 12 and under allowed, to kind of create a kid-free zone. They want to try it out, see if people are more pleased with how things are set up. Again, some good research possibly going on there. Second one, experiment claims economy seats are safer. They test crashed a plane in the Sonoran Desert in Mexico, and they discovered that people sitting in the front of the plane are subject to much higher G-forces than those sitting at the back of the plane. So if you're ever in a plane crash, you're much safer and more likely to survive the further you are on the plane. Finally, Club Med predicts bright future for all-inclusives. Based on some research with approximately 40 tour providers in that, there seems to be a good solid growth going on in the all-inclusive market. And this is globally. Okay, so potentially that's where a bit of the market is heading. That and actually cruise ships seem to be also weathering the storm fairly well. All right. As per usual, if you guys ever find any interesting news articles that you want to share with the group, just put them up into the discussion board. Okay, so talking about good research or good research design, and it's really important for you, especially when it comes up to your project coming next term or next, to make sure that you've thought all about how you want your research design, what's important, what's in it, things like that. And part of the good research design is about where you're going to get your information from. And one of the important techniques with that is something called a snowball technique, where you find one article that is particularly relevant, really worthwhile for you, and then check into the references that they've used. And because chances are, if that one really relevant article has some good information, some of the sources that they've used are probably particularly relevant to you. And you just go from there, expanding out, growing and growing. Something that I find very useful, and I'm much more of a visual sort of person, is to develop a bit of a graphical diagram framework to help describe some of the key relationships, to set out some of the key variables that you're going to be looking at, and just getting a sense, and keeping an open mind, but just thinking about how things are related and what you're going to want to be looking at. It also helps if you're trying to describe your planned research to somebody else, to be able to show them a diagram, because that can sometimes much better illustrate what you're going to be looking at. And Very important to outline the procedures right from the start to the end of the research. And as much as possible, not leaving things to chance and, not working things out as you go. With the realization, of course, that things don't always work out and being flexible where necessary. Now, similar to the, think about the 5 Ws and things about doing realism or realistic research, several other factors that you need to be thinking about when you're working on your research. First off, what's the purpose of the research? And for things like this, and objectives and research questions to be explored, now, granted, that may change somewhat through your research, but being as specific as possible early on and very clearly identifying what you're trying to solve, what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish with the research is very important. As much for yourself as when you're going to explain things to someone else. How much is already known about the problem? There's kind of 3 different key ways or key things to be thinking about when you're doing research, and based around the amount of previous knowledge about the problem. You've got exploratory research. This is kind of that initial phase or initial thinking about the research where not much is known, and you're just trying to get a sense of what are the key aspects that are important, what are the key characteristics, what are the key factors that are part of this whole relationship that you're investigating. Explanatory is kind of the next phase of that whole knowledge and level of knowledge, where most of that exploration has been done, but all you know is what's important to look at, not why necessarily things are important to look at. And with the explanatory, that's where you start thinking about, why is this important? What's its role in the whole process? Things like that. And then your final stage of this kind of knowledge growth is descriptive, where you're actually starting to describe some of the relationships and possibly even being a bit prescriptive and saying, one thing causes another, or there's a relationship between these two, and one grows as the other one gets smaller, things like that. So again, much more in-depth understanding of the various processes. Also very important is whether or not you can build on the research of others. Wherever possible, don't reinvent the wheel. If somebody else has done similar research somewhere else, take their ideas. You don't have to take them, word for word, step by step, but at least build on what they've done, learn from their mistakes, and go from there. Somewhat similar to the whole snowball technique as well, is to be thinking about if somebody has done a similar sort of research, but possibly in a different area, a different field, and again, whether or not you can borrow some of their ideas and just retask them to your own needs. How much control do you have over the relevant variables? And kind of a key phrase or key term in this situation is something called ex post facto, essentially after the fact, which means all you're doing is you're going into a situation, assessing it, whether you're surveying or whatever the case may be, and then trying to determine what's going on, just basically as things go. Versus experimental research, where you're actually going in and you're trying to manipulate some of the situation, creating differences, changes, and then seeing what sort of effect happens. So kind of 2 different ways of looking at your role in the whole process. what's the influence of time on the research? And there's several things to be considered with this. How much time is required to actually do the research? How much time do you have? Remember, we were talking previously about things like, when does that research need to be done? When do people need to use it? Things like that. How much resources do you have? When you guys are working on your final project, you've only got a certain amount of time that you need to be thinking about. So you can't take forever to do your research. And also very important at this point when you think about time is to better understand what's going on. Does a snapshot work for you? Or do you need to have a bit of longitudinal understanding? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to stretch the research over time, but that could also be, how far back in time do you have to look at to understand the situation? Give an example. If I tell you what the current exchange rate is between Canada and the United States, and say that they're, roughly on par, dollar for dollar, that may mean nothing to you. Because, is that good or bad? It's just a fact, more or less. However, if I explain to you that, previous history was that the Canadian dollar used to be worth a lot less than the American dollar, suddenly that gives that significance, some better understanding to what's going on in this situation and what that current rate, what it actually means. Okay? How much does the environmental context influence some of the mechanisms that you're looking at? There's times where, your environmental conditions, things that are going on in the situation, may play a very important role and help to really understand what's going on in the situation. To give you an example of this, some of the times when I used to be doing research in the national parks, and even though the people would be doing just a typical survey and talking to people, for example, maybe on a trailhead, trying to understand the types of users on that trailhead, I would also have them describe some of the day's conditions. What was the weather like? Were there any special events going on? Things like that could possibly affect the sort of responses that we got that day from the people visiting. Same sort of thing can happen if you're doing some research in a hotel or a restaurant. When you're conducting the research, possibly there's a marathon going on, and that's why you've got this sudden increase in, physically active people staying at your hotel. And if you were to base your decisions on that limited amount and that particular market or that particular type of respondent, you could come to some very different conclusions in your research. So sometimes those environmental context clues can really affect the sort of responses and the sort of research that you do. Will the perceptions of the subjects influence the research results? And by this, and just as an example, sometimes you get very politically correct responses, politically correct answers. When you ask somebody whether or not they would be willing to donate an extra $1 on the price of their plane ticket for carbon offsetting, and you'll get people going, well, yeah, of course I would. That's the right thing to do. But when that option is actually put out there for somebody when they're buying their ticket online, that rate of acceptance of paying that little extra money is much lower than it comes out in the surveys. So you need to be thinking about that when you start talking about, sort of survey responses versus real life actions. Will the subjects act unnaturally during the research, and especially if they know that the research is occurring? You're conducting research in an environmentally sensitive place, and people realize that this research is going on, so of course they're going to pick up garbage after themselves, and they're going to stay to the trails and things like that. So if you're trying to get people in a natural state, what do you have to do, and what considerations do you need to make in order to get that sort of natural process? Finally, don't forget your ethical concerns. What should you do? What can you do to remain with that sort of ethical consideration, ethical boundaries? And some final quick considerations. Be prepared to move out of your comfort zone. And this is something that you guys will probably, will hopefully be thinking about when you're doing your research project. Some of you, and I've talked to previous students before, some of you may be more comfortable with qualitative versus quantitative research, and if you're not sure about those terms, we're actually going to talk about that in a moment. Numbers versus more feelings or qualitative information. You may want to step outside and try something new, something different. Not completely different necessarily, but at least push the boundaries of what you're used to doing and not doing. And the final one, again, kind of just a quick reminder of don't let the research method dictate the research. If you've got a hammer, don't look at everything as being a nail. So keep an open mind and make sure that you are applying the best research method to answer your problems, not creating a problem so you can use your research method. Some of the key things you want to be thinking about to show in your research design. These are just a few of the headers. Things like the purpose. What are you trying to achieve? And kind of like a good roadmap, a good tour guide, things like that. When will you know that you've reached your destination? When you've achieved your research purpose. That's why you need to be fairly clear about your research purpose. Theories. If at all possible, be very clear about any underlying model or framework that you're using. And just to show that your research has a good foundation. Research questions. Making sure that there's very clear links between your research questions and your purpose that you've set out. There's things where there's nice to know information and need to know information. Nice to know, if you don't have that clear link with your nice to know information back to your purpose, you probably shouldn't bother your research with conducting that or asking those. Scope. Scope really clarifies what's in and is not in your research. And sometimes that's very important because it's as much about clarifying, how far is this research applicable? Why did you talk to these people and not these other people? Well, because they weren't part of your scope. They weren't part of the area or the things that you were interested in. Of course, the methods, how you plan on conducting your research. The strategy. Now, the strategy takes that methods a little bit further by clearly setting out, what you're going to do when, what's going to happen at the various phases, things like that. Step 1, step 2, things like that. And finally, contingencies. Now, earlier I mentioned things don't always work out the way that you planned, the way that you hoped. So you need to be prepared just in case. What are you going to do if you can't get access to a particular area? What are you going to do if your plan to talk to people and you get rained out during that season? How are you going to contact people? So just be prepared in case things don't work out exactly as planned. Important at this stage is to also be thinking about the difference between primary and secondary research. And this gets into, whether or not you're conducting the research versus just using the research of other people. And there's absolutely nothing wrong when it's applicable to use secondary research to answer your questions. There's a lot of really good information that can be gathered by just using secondary research. And sometimes what's done is something called a meta-analysis, where you will take the secondary research from several different sources, and maybe several different areas, several different people, and you put it all together and do one large analysis of a situation. And a lot of really good information can come out of this sort of broad scope look at a problem from several different angles, several different areas, several different perspectives. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with doing secondary research, with letting somebody else do the work and you doing the analysis or reanalysis possibly of their work. But primary research is where you're the one actually conducting the research, where you're the one talking to the people, you're the one observing the behaviors, you're the one out in the field and getting a first-hand look at what's going on. That sort of direct contact with the situation. Now, the nice thing about that is that you can be fairly sure that the information that you're getting is exactly what you need to answer your problem. However, in general, that primary research does take longer, and frequently it's more resource intense, time and money. So, you need to think about that and compare whether or not primary versus secondary research will meet your needs. Now, earlier mentioned quantitative versus qualitative research. And for those of you that don't know, very simply, quantitative research is numbers. So, typically think of surveys, traffic counts, heads in beds, things like that. As I got there, time spent at exhibits or signs. It's all down to numbers and means and medians and things like that, data analyses. Qualitative research is a much more descriptive explanation of a situation. It's much more into, how do people feel about something and open-ended questions and things like that. It's focus groups and interviews, case studies of a situation where you're taking an in-depth look at all of the environmental conditions and things like that. So, and depending upon your research needs, your purpose for your research, you may need quantitative or qualitative or a combination of the two. So that's where it's important to understand what sort of information is needed to answer your question. Somewhat related to that is the concept of a fixed or flexible design strategy. And depending upon your research purpose again, how much flexibility you need, how much things are going to change throughout the process of conducting the research versus how much of it you can be prescriptive before you start and keep things fairly on track and fixed right from that starting day to completion of the research. One of the key considerations in whether you're conducting fixed or flexible research is how much prior knowledge do you have? Again, thinking back to exploratory, explanatory, descriptive, things like that. If you're the first down into an area, chances are not that much is known about a situation, which means you need to be much more flexible in how you conduct the research. Fixed designs, very tight pre-specification of what you're going to do, when, how, things like that. Fixed designs tend to be more fixed, more quantitative than qualitative, but not necessarily. And it's quite often more confirmatory or more concerned about group concepts, group ideas, than it is about, kind of an individual's perception of a situation. Always key in any situation is making sure you do it pre-testing, but even more so with a fixed design, because the idea being once you get into doing the research, you're trying not to change anything at all. Some typical types of fixed designs. Well, there's a whole scale of experimental research where you've either got one or two or more groups that you're actually changing some of the conditions and seeing the effect of you changing conditions. And with that, there's either true experimental or something called quasi-experimental. There's also non-experimental fixed designs where you're really not changing conditions, you're just assessing or measuring what's going on. With flexible designs, it's a much different perspective or much different way of looking at conducting research, because what happens is you go into the situation with some general ideas, but with the understanding that things are probably going to change a fair amount throughout the process. And it tends to be much more qualitative, and you really have to work the situation based on the findings as you go. Example of that might be you're conducting a focus group into perceptions of a new marketing plan, and people start talking about certain aspects of that marketing plan. With a flexible design, you have that ability to change how you're conducting the research and possibly pursue these points that you hadn't thought of before, versus a fixed design where you've got essentially maybe a survey that has been done beforehand and you don't change it partway through the research generally. Some of the characteristics for a good flexible design researcher got listed there from your textbook, from Robson. An inquiring mind, good listening skills. Really listening and understanding to not only what people are saying, but also what they're not saying, and sometimes what they're not doing can be very telling. Ability to adapt and staying as objective as possible. Some typical flexible designs. You've got case studies where you really try to understand a complete situation all of the environmental conditions, things like that, of one or a few different situations. Ethnographic studies, and that's where you're really trying to understand the culture and social situation, trying to understand things from that sort of environmental cultural perspective. And grounded theory studies, where you're trying to understand things and create a theory based on what you find on the ground, essentially, in that sort of real life situation. One other thing that I want to talk about here is field experiments. Now, a lot of you are probably going to be doing field experiments, and that's essentially taking your research out of the, out of the lab, out of the, the factory, out into the real world, and conducting your research. And some possible advantages to doing your field research is you're in a much more real, much more natural situation. People tend to be much more natural and they act more natural. You can get a lot more participants when you're out in the field actually conducting your research. Some possible disadvantages, though, is making sure that you're talking to the right people and getting a good broad section of people that you're talking to. Sometimes it can be real ethical issues and potential gray areas, I say there. How much can you tell people and not create those sort of unnatural behaviors? And when you're out in the field, you have much less control over conditions. Now, just to kind of demonstrate this sort of thing, one year I was doing some research into some wildlife publications that were being produced in Banff National Park and some of the other national parks, talking about interaction with wildlife. And we decided to conduct focus groups. So as part of these focus groups, we actually ended up going into a cook shack in a campground and conducting the focus group there. So we were able to talk to people that we probably wouldn't have otherwise. Typically, you're not going to get that many campers, especially when you're doing that sort of research. You're not going to get a lot of campers taking time out of their holidays to come to a focus group. So we took the focus group to the campers. But to kind of demonstrate some of the disadvantages, we certainly had a lot less control over the situation. Some of the people that were in the focus group were paying attention to the focus group, but then also paying attention to their campsite. But we felt that any of the negatives, any of the downsides to conducting the research in that situation far outweighed, or the advantages far outweighed the disadvantages. So that's why we decided on that. Finally, some important considerations when you're conducting research. These are some key terms, key concepts you need to know. Validity, generalizability, and reliability. Now, validity. Do the findings accurately describe the situation? Is it a true understanding of the situation, or is it a bit of a mistake or unclear understanding of that situation? Now, in your textbook, there's some potential threats to the validity, and sometimes it's called internal validity. Some of considerations, things like mortality and Yes, it can be as gruesome as somebody, not surviving, but generally mortality just refers to people dropping out of the study. Not a concern if you're doing a snapshot, but if you're doing a bit of a long-term or several phases to your research, and you're talking to the same people in every phase, you have to, think about what's going to happen when some of your people drop out, which inevitably happens. Selection, instrumentation. Another consideration when you think about validity is something called triangulation, where you try to look at the same problem but from a few different perspectives, potentially a few different techniques, and if you're coming up with the same response or same results from those different perspectives, it just adds to the confidence that you have in your information. Generalizability, also called external validity. This is the sort of thing where, sure, your research gave you some interesting results, told you a lot about this, relationship or something in this particular case, but is that information actually valid? Is it real? Can you apply it in another situation? And that can be key to how useful your information might be. Finally, reliability is whether or not your results are going to be consistent over time, or whether that snapshot you've got is, sure, you might have been able to describe the situation very accurately at that point in time. However, 3 months, 6 months down the road, do those results, are they still useful? Are they still valid? Do they still accurately describe the situation? And that can also be important whether talking about how useful your information is. And that's it for this week. All right, so everyone, please make sure that you've done your readings and participating in your discussion groups. And not only that, but good luck on your assignment. Okay, thanks and have a good day.